Well, welcome to this thought for the day for the 14th of May, 2020. We're just going to finish off today our theme of the mystical life and living the mystical life, which is part of Franciscan spirituality. And we're going to finish that off today by discussing the phenomenon that happened for Francis in his life when he received the Stigmata. There are echoes in Francis's life, as there is in most of his journey. He really did live and try to live echoing the life of Jesus and modeling the walk that Jesus walked. He took the call to follow Christ very literally. And when you look over the pattern of his life from his conversion to his death, it echoes very much the life and ministry of Jesus as he walked this life. And that's the wonderful thing about Franciscan spirituality, is that Francis was no more special than the rest of us. Yes, he had a unique call, and he perhaps could walk places that other people in his spiritual journey that others of us can't walk. But he was an ordinary guy, just as we are ordinary people. So he shows us that we can live in the model of Christ and walk the same sort of walk that Jesus walked and calls us to walk. And the Stigmata is one of these really fascinating mysteries. Some people don't believe that he received, and for those of you who don't know what the Stigmata is effectively the 5 wounds that Christ received on the cross. The 2 on the hands, the 2 on the feet, and the 1 in the side from the lance. And in completely identifying with Christ and the walk that Jesus walked in life, now we get to the point where we see Francis completely identifying with Jesus as he walked to the cross. And the last 2 years of Francis's journey in this world echoed that journey that Jesus made to Jerusalem, to eventually where again Francis surrenders himself to the embrace of sister death, or sister bodily death, just as Jesus surrendered on the cross. And so we see these echoes. And in most things, when it comes to the mystical understanding of things, there are paradoxes. And on a surface level, in a dualistic understanding of the world, these paradoxes don't seem to resolve. They only make real sense to a person who has gone deeper into the spiritual journey and see things from a more mystical and deeper spiritual level, just as Francis did. And we see that in the pattern that we talked about purgation, illumination, and union. And here in the Stigmata we see the ultimate union that Francis had with identifying with the life of Jesus the Christ. And he identified both with Christ's suffering, but he realized that suffering and love go hand in hand. If you don't love fully to the greatest extent, then your suffering's light. Those who don't love much don't lose much. And therefore we get a real glimpse into the nature of God. We have a suffering God. Because if God is ultimate love, he is also ultimate suffering. And that's the model that Jesus shows us. If Jesus is the fullest revelation of God we've ever had on earth, then it shows us that God is a suffering God. And he's been suffering because from the beginning of creation not just on the cross, because he's loved completely his creation, including us, since the beginning of, since he created. It's part of the spiritual journey. And those of us who start to learn to let go into this love that Jesus had, that Jesus shows us, that God has for us, just as Francis did, it will bring additional suffering. It's one of those things. But it's not coercive. It's not coercive in any way, because we're drawn in to the suffering and love of God in his scheme in the world. Just as in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see that Jesus' journey to the cross, which was the greatest act of love, but required the greatest amount of suffering on our behalf, wasn't coercive. He surrendered his will to the will of God because he could see that the scheme of God, just as Francis echoes in his last, as he receives the wounds of Christ and suffers greatly on behalf of his brothers and sisters in the Franciscan order and for the whole world. Just as Christ in Jesus wept over Jerusalem, which is a figurative weeping for the whole of creation and its brokenness and its separation from God, is the same weeping that we see from Francis when he spends the whole night at his friend's place in prayer, just repeating, "My God, my all." When Francis experienced great joy and the joy of the love of God, he would often end that joy by ending up in tears, because in engaging in the joy and love of God, he also entered into the great pain and suffering that God experiences in regards to his world. And we have this other paradox of companions or communion and solitude. You know, the more Francis needed to be around his companions, the more he needed solitude as well. But he needed his friends' support in his solitude. Again, echoing Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he took his 3 closest friends with him to a quiet place, and then he went on a little bit further into solitude. But he needed the presence of his friends there supporting him. And that's what we see in Francis's journey as well. As he approached his death, he was surrounded by 7 of his closest friars, and they were there, but they couldn't enter the place he was going because it wasn't their time. But they could be there in solidarity with him as companions, and to support his solitude, his entering into the presence of God. And that's what all of us at the time of death of a loved one can do, is just be there, be a presence for them. So as I said, he followed the life of Jesus so closely, and now he follows it in the example into death. And just a quote from Brother Ramon's book, and I commend this passage on this chapter on the Stigmata in his book. It's so much more full than I'm going to give you today, and it pulls out the richness of the symbolic nature of this infliction of the wounds on Francis. But he says here, the Stigmata experience of Francis was not a selfish pursuit and coveted identity, but a confirmation of the truth and the seal of God. For from his conversion, Francis had always sought and found his identity in God. It is only as we discover who we are within the love of God that we are able to experience our own integration and become reconcilers and peacemakers among those around us, which I think is just a wonderful way of understanding it. In fact, the Stigmata experience for Francis wasn't really for him, it was for those around him. And there's this real identification with Christ and the world with Francis. And there's this wonderful poem, which again, Brother Ramon puts in his book, which I'm going to read to you in full, because with Brother Ramon's additional commentary on it, because it is just so wonderful. So this is going to be a bit of, this may run into 15 minutes today, but it's well worth it. Bear with me. So this poem is from a priest missionary who was in Africa, Arthur Shirley Crisps, and it's called The Death of Francis, and it shows so wonderfully the identification of Francis with Christ, in how closely identified Francis was with the life of Christ. So here we go. The thing is sacred, dear. Hands grew to hands, feet seemed to grow to feet. His hands to my hands, feet of his to mine. Exalted and extended on his cross. I seemed in one great stab of eager pain to feel his heart beating within my heart. I cannot tell the half of it, yet here the rush of feeling still comes back to me. From that proud torture hanging on his cross, from that gold rapture of his heart in mine. Then Brother Ramon says, then there's an amazing shift in Francis's identification with Christ in his passion to an identification in Christ, taking to himself the suffering and darkness of the world's sin. And it goes on in further stanzas. I knew in blissful anguish what it means to be a part of Christ and feel as mine the dark distresses of my brother's limbs, to feel it bodily and simply true, to feel as mine the starving of his poor, to feel as mine the shadow of curse on all. Hard words, hard looks, and savage misery, and struggling deaths unpitied and unwept. I feel rich brothers' sad satirities, and the weary manner of their lives and deaths. What want in love and lacking love lack all, to feel the heavy sorrow of the world, thickened and thickened on to future hell, to mighty cries with their miles of streets, where men seek work for days and walk and starve, freezing on riverbanks on winter nights, and come at last to cord or stream or still. Then Brother Ramon adds, the poem moves through the darkness, malice, and black hiddenness of human sin and cruelty, feeling, bearing, atoning for it all, then bursts forth in forgiveness and divine love. Francis in Christ sees, pities, understands, and bears all the sadness, waste, and emptiness of human sin and sorrow, and pours out heartfelt mercy in drawing sinners home to reconciling love. So the poem continues. O heart of Jesus, sacred, passionate, anguish it was, yet anguish, and that was bliss, to love them heart to heart, each selfish heart, to clasp them close and pray in utter truth, Father, forgive, they know not what they do. One was the heart of him that ground the poor weary heart, so blinded and misled. One was the heart of her that reeked in shame, poor weary heart, so blinded and misled. One was my heart that wasted half its years, and knew so little how to use the rest. To God's sole glory and the love of men, poor weary heart, so blinded and misled. Then Brother Ramon continues, and then, wonders of wonders, Francis in Christ confronts the malignant source of satanic hatred that pollutes and corrupts human weakness. There, with one awful thrill of fire and ecstasy, he destroys the hatred of Satan and is pierced in the hands and feet and side with the wounds of Calvary. So the poem continues. And oh, the sacred heart burnt up in flame against the harsh misleader of our world. And oh, I felt an awful thrill of love, as with one heartbeat of wild ecstasy, I set my feet upon that serpent's head. In resolute anguish, watching how the fangs snapping at my heel and goring it into blood, my heel as yet shall grind his head to dust. Was it I who did that? Nay, the Christ in me. But I woke, his prints were in my hands and in my feet, while in my side there showed, as it were, the heart wound from the soldier's lance. And I just think that sums up the wonderful and identification of Francis with Christ in both his life and in his death. And it's Christ incarnate, not just in Francis, but in us. And I'm going to finish this section with one little extra quotation from Brother Ramon in regards to the incarnation. Francis entered into union with Christ in love. In such a life he suffered in and with Christ. He took to himself the pains and sorrows of his brothers and sisters, and then confronted the powers of darkness at their source. This is what the gospel meant to Francis, and that is what it must mean to us. Christ becomes incarnate in the believer, in the way in which our response to God's call is lived out becomes our personal vocation. For some, it will be an apostolic life of preaching and prayer. For others, a mystical life of contemplation. For some, it will be a missionary call to the ends of the earth, perhaps with the suffering of martyrdom to crown it. For others, it will be a faithful living out of home, family, and involvement with other agencies of compassion, peace, and justice. Life stories may vary greatly, but all God's people are called to incarnate Christ in the world. And that's the real mystical journey and mystical life of the Franciscan way and the model of Francis, and also the ultimate meaning of Francis's receiving the Stigmata. That was his call into expressing the incarnation of Christ in the world. The question goes out, what's yours? And don't expect it to be the same as someone else's. Sorry, it's long today, but it was worth it, I think, anyway. Enjoy.